Metroid Prime 4 draws closer every day. If you're a massive Metroid Prime trilogy fan like I am, you already understand how agonizing the wait has been. Based on recent job listings at Retro Studios and the general rumor mill, it appears the game might be revealed or even released in the not too distant future, meaning within the next year or so. Between the gathering hype and the release of Metroid Prime Remastered, I've spent quite a bit of time internally debating what I actually want to see from this game. I hope Retro blows us away with plenty of surprises, but there are also key elements that I hope aren't lost in the first new 3D Metroid Prime game in almost 15 years. And no, I'm not counting Metroid Prime Federation Force. I also want to touch on when I personally think this game will release and why it will arrive in that time frame. So please hit like and subscribe to support the channel, and let's dive in. I'm going to start with possibly my most controversial request for this game, which is actually a rename. I personally just don't think this game should be called Metroid Prime 4 for a few reasons. I think too much time has passed since the original trilogy for this to act as a numerical continuation, even if it should definitely still be a spiritual successor. Gamers who are born in this century might not even be old enough to have played the full trilogy and may not have a strong attachment to that branding. Newer fans who picked up Metroid Prime Remastered and played it for the first time may not even have played 2 and 3, since there is actually no easy way to do that right now outside of emulators or very old consoles. Hopefully Nintendo releases 2 and 3 on Switch in the near future, but I just think the branding attachment to the trilogy has become too niche. Also, the Metroid Prime trilogy was, well, a trilogy. If you played those 3 games, they are wrapped up somewhat neatly by the end of the 3rd game. Yes, there are still some loose ends they could pursue, and the threats Samus faces never really seem to go away. However, I would prefer a brand new 3D Metroid game 16 years later to start a new plot thread of its own that future games could build off of. The Prime suffix by default has always referred to the first-person 3D Metroid games, but not all 3D Metroid games more generally have included this suffix, such as the controversial Other M. I personally really like names such as Metroid Fusion or Metroid Dread, simpler, punchy titles that are easy to remember. I wouldn't be that opposed to keeping the Metroid Prime label and adding some other suffix onto it like Echoes or Corruption did and just lose the number, but that still just doesn't make a ton of sense unless the game actually features some sort of enemy presence in the form of a Prime Metroid. I'm also worried that keeping the number 4 in the title will just scare away some new players, and I think it's the same mistake Nintendo made with Pikmin 4. The Prime trilogy actually has a lot of similarities in terms of release timeline and structure to the Pikmin games, a popular trilogy that came out over a decade ago. Pikmin 4 kept the core concepts of the series, but introduced new visuals and lots of changes that, in my opinion, made it sort of a soft reboot, and that's actually what I'm hoping for with Prime 4. I also think Pikmin 4 should have been called something else, since you really don't need to have played the first 3 and the connections between them are vague and minimal. There will undoubtedly be a small audience that thinks they should play the first 3 before jumping in and never get around to it. I want Prime 4 to sell as many copies as possible for a series that has always been a bit hit or miss in terms of sales. Next, there have been various rumors floating around out there that Metroid Prime 4 might adapt some sort of wide linear or micro open world environments, similar to what we saw with games like God of War, Jedi Survivor, the Tomb Raider series, and others. This style of game features several small open hub areas with branching paths waiting to be unlocked. Personally, I think this would be a great way to evolve the 3D Metroid structure to feel more modern while still maintaining that lock and key progression and isolated, intricate environments. I think it would be cool to have some more open areas that present tons of different paths to try and explore and find your way through. As soon as you leave the main hub areas, you're back into smaller, detailed environments full of puzzles and tunnels and corridors. This setup could also help to make the game feel a little bit bigger. Although Metroid Prime Remastered is incredible, in 2023 the world can feel a bit small. I'd love to see the size of the explorable area expanded quite a bit, as long as the intricate, handcrafted feel of things remains intact. If you've played Metroid Prime 1, essentially think of these hub areas as larger versions of the ruined courtyard in the Chozo Ruins, or that main area of Phendrana Drifts. The environments you walk through could gradually get smaller as you get further from this main area and are connected by traditional Metroid secrets, tunnels, caves, and so on. This setup would also provide the option for another one of my requested features, which is to make the world feel unified and cohesive. Personally, I hope Prime 4 takes place all on one deep, rich planet, with maybe a very occasional off-world segment for a key story moment or change of pace. On that planet, I would also love to see a reduction in the number of elevator rides or shuttles you have to take to get around. I do think there should be some limited fast travel options, but I also really hope you can walk to any part of the world almost seamlessly. I think Metroid Dread had too many different unconnected environments that required constant trams or awkward teleportation devices that sort of break up the flow. Metroid Prime 3 also felt very disjointed, with constant ship travel cutscenes between different planets or even sections of planets. I'd love to see something closer to Metroid Prime 1 or 2, or even improved upon those, where you can just directly walk pretty much anywhere in the game, but ideally those cutscene elevator rides would be replaced with something a little more interactive. I think the recent Dead Space remake is a good example of updating an older level design to feature a single, cohesive, and traversable environment. The loading screen tram rides were replaced by real-time, still playable rides, and you could often walk between sections of the large ship without using that train system at all. I do hope Metroid Prime 4 has plenty of different biomes, though, so some sort of interactive rapid transit between them would still be welcome. I think it would also be interesting if Metroid Prime 4 made some changes to the gameplay and combat systems to add more depth and player flexibility. For example, introducing some sort of additional upgrade system on top of the key power-ups. Now, I'm not suggesting turning this into an RPG or anything like that, but for example, maybe alongside missile expansions, Samus could find some version of energy cores or units that allow you to upgrade different aspects of her suit or systems to impact the style of play. Maybe you could decide which beams or upgrades to further power up and add abilities to, increase her defensive capabilities, gain minor movement advantages, just something to give the player a little more freedom versus just one single path of upgrades. I think Dead Space is a good example again here, where you find power cores that let you choose which weapons to upgrade based on your interests, or you can just power up your suit more, etc., but all of the core power-ups are still the same for every player. I hope Prime 4 has a bit more diversity in terms of weapons, where you can more freely move between different beams for different situations and choose how you upgrade them after finding them. One idea I keep going back and forth on is whether I'd want this game to include a combat lock-on mechanic like the other Prime games, and I think the answer is no. I think the gameplay should feel snappy and precise enough to not need lock-on. The original Metroid Prime games used this lock-on mechanic to simplify combat, partially due to the strange control setup of the GameCube. However, in 2023, in my opinion, the different beam weapons fire too slowly in the remaster to fully leverage that new dual analog setup. I always still just use the lock-on mechanic when playing, since the beam projectiles such as the ice beam and wave beam fire and travel very slowly. I'd love to see a more aggressive, faster pace to the beam weapons and combat in general to make Samus feel more like a deadly bounty hunter. At the same time, I would also love to see the scan visor and slower parts of the gameplay expanded. Scanning really took kind of a back seat in Metroid Prime 3 and especially Other M, and I'd love to see it return in full form as a priority. It would be great to have scan data just everywhere and be a core component of puzzle solving or even some sort of data collection upgrade system. I think the scan visor provides a high level of immersion and lets you go a layer deeper in understanding the world around you. I hope visors make an epic return in general. I thought the visors in Prime 3 were a little bit lame. I'd love to see some cool visual effects and gameplay layers built around this. I'd also like to see the introduction of very light side missions or side quests. No, I don't want a hub town with lots of interaction with other characters sending you on fetch quests. I want to retain that feeling of isolation. However, I think it would be cool if there was some way to introduce side missions to break up the main path and encourage optional side exploration of a rich world. Maybe Samus is subtly given extra missions from the Federation, or maybe she discovers logs or situations that reveal important side mission opportunities that yield optional upgrades. Perhaps even an occasional alien or character interaction, distress call, etc. gives her something else to track down and help with. I would definitely want fewer, more meaningful missions in this context, not just pointless filler quests. I think Dead Space is again sort of a good example of adding side missions into a Metroid-ish formula game, but I think the missions would need to be higher quality or with better rewards than what that offered. I realize that game is more of just a third-person shooter at heart, but some of the concepts do apply. Next, I would like to see Prime 4 adapt light but impactful cinematic storytelling. I've talked about this in my other Metroid videos, but my favorite storytelling approach in this series is found in games like Echoes or Dread, where although you spend most of the game alone, there are still big moments and even an occasional new character. I think having a more specific, clearly told story adds gravity and meaning to Samus's exploration. And I think in 2023, this sort of cinematic element could help the series feel more modern. Compelling beginning and end story sequences, supported by the very occasional cinematic moment during the main stretch of gameplay, I think that could be an effective formula. Personally, I also really hope that Metroid Prime 4 is either a cross gen title or a next gen Switch exclusive. I think at this point it's highly unlikely that it's a next gen exclusive, given the sheer size of the Switch install base, the development lifecycle, and Nintendo's messaging around the game, but I hope it's at least cross gen. Cross gen would obviously be critical to drive huge sales through the current Switch's large audience. I'm hoping this game sells a ton of copies to encourage more frequent future titles after such a long gap. Personally, I think Prime 4 will end up what Breath of the Wild was for Wii U and Switch, a swan song that pushes the old console to the max while offering a major new title at launch that gives a glimpse of the next generation. Although Breath of the Wild had a couple very minor graphical improvements on Switch, I hope Prime 4 goes even further and takes advantage of the new hardware. This could happen in a variety of ways, whether it's just increased environmental detail, resolution, or frame rate. Personally, I'm hoping this game looks as incredible as the rumors suggest, so I wouldn't even be opposed to a stunning game that makes the sacrifice to run at 30 frames per second on the original Switch and 60 on the next gen system in order to achieve those crazy visuals for the hardware, but I realize that'll be a controversial opinion. Prime Remastered looks stunning in 60 FPS, and many gamers would probably be unhappy to see Prime 4 running at 30. I'd also be perfectly happy if it runs at 60 on both, but maybe runs on Switch 2 at native 1440p with some graphical enhancements, and on the original Switch at 1080 or 900p with some minor sacrifices. Personally, I think Switch 2 will be capable of 4K output, but that most games will probably not hit that resolution without aggressive upscaling, instead running at native 1440 or even 1080, but I digress, that's a different topic. And that leads us to the final discussion point, which is when this game will actually release. Personally, I'm not surprised at all that this game has taken so long. I think people had unrealistic expectations when Nintendo announced a full reboot in 2019. It's not as though Retro Studios was just primed and ready to take over development. It seems like it was handed off to them in that year, but that it probably took at least a year or two for them to come up with a new vision for the game, hire staff, revisit past titles to educate the newer team, many of whom didn't work on the originals, etc. This game is also a level of magnitude more complicated than their other recent work, such as the 2D Donkey Kong games. Retro also did most of the work to remaster Prime 1, possibly as a way of getting the team familiar with the game engine, enhancing it for modern hardware, and becoming immersed in the original titles. I wouldn't be surprised if hardcore development didn't even start until well into 2020 on Prime 4, and big budget, high production games like this usually take 4 to 6 years to complete. For those reasons, I think we're looking at a late 2024 release, and I think it's going to be a cross-gen title for the new Switch. In fact, I think that's one of the main reasons we haven't seen anything from this game yet. Nintendo is possibly waiting to make a major dual announcement of the Switch 2 with Metroid Prime 4, or whatever it's called, as a launch title. I think renaming Prime 4 also helps as a launch title to showcase that it's something new, but enough about that topic. Although it will be playable on the current Switch, I think from a marketing standpoint, it might be a big selling point of the new system, just like Breath of the Wild was for the Switch. And even if Switch 2 isn't backwards compatible, which would be the worst thing ever for many reasons I'll cover in another video, I still think this will be cross-gen where they just release a native version of it on the new system. So personally, I think Metroid Prime 4 will be revealed in early spring of 2024 along with the Switch 2, and then both will be released together later that year, as well as on the original Switch. I think this timeline just makes sense from both a development and marketing standpoint, and Retro Studios to this day still has job openings on their site that seem related to Metroid Prime 4, so I think this game probably has at least another year of development and will end up a late fall or holiday 2024 release. I also hope Nintendo will pad out that time frame by releasing an Echoes port or remaster in late 2023, followed by maybe a Metroid Prime 3 port in the spring. However, I do think these ports or remasters are more complicated than Prime 1 for various reasons that I discuss in my other remaster videos on my channel. Retro Studios did the work to remaster Prime 1, which has supposedly been done for some time, so I'm not sure they have the bandwidth to fully remaster or even port these games over while in the middle of Prime 4 development. If Prime 1 Remastered really was just a way to modernize the engine and technology and bring the team up to speed, it's possible we may never even see remasters or ports of the second two games. So anyways, what would you like to see from Prime 4? What do you think about this list? Did I forget anything? I know I'm asking for a lot here, but I'm excited about this game. Are any of these suggestions absurd? Please hit subscribe to support the channel and let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time.